Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Ready when you are.
Perfect, because today we're tackling a topic that's pretty crucial to, well, pretty much everything these days. Semiconductors.
The tiny chips that power, well, everything.
Exactly. But more specifically, we're looking at China's massive push to become a major player in the semiconductor game.
And whether they're actually catching up to the big players or maybe even, dare I say, taking the lead in innovation.
Exactly. And to help us unpack all of this, we're diving into this IDIF report, How Innovative is China in Semiconductors? So buckle up, because this is a wild ride.
It really is. It's complex, it's global, and it has huge implications.
No pressure then. So I think it's a good place to start with a quick refresher. For anyone who just tuned in thinking, semi what now? What are these things and why should we even care?
Right. So in the simplest terms, semiconductors are these tiny chips, like you said, and they're the brains behind pretty much every electronic device we use. Your phone, your laptop, your car, your smart toaster oven, you name it, it's got semiconductors. And they're not just some simple on-off switches.
Oh, absolutely not. We're talking billions with a B of transistors packed onto these tiny little chips, all working together to process information at incredible speeds.
It's mind-blowing when you really think about it. And this report does a great job of breaking down the industry, which is surprisingly complex.
It's not just about making the chips. It's about designing them, manufacturing them, and then there's the whole ecosystem of companies that make the specialized equipment and materials needed for the whole process.
Yeah, it's a whole thing. And one of the things the report really emphasizes is this process called lithography. It's like this super precise printing process, but instead of ink, they're using light to etch these insanely small patterns onto the silicon wafers.
And when we say insanely small, we're talking nanometers. To give you an idea, a human hair is about 75,000 nanometers wide. Some of these chips are using transistors that are just a few nanometers across.
It's crazy. So obviously, to make something that small, you need incredibly specialized and expensive equipment.
Exactly. And that's one of the key bottlenecks for China. They don't have easy access to the most advanced lithography machines, mainly because of export controls. So they've had to get creative.
Okay, so that makes sense. But here's what I find interesting. The report mentions that despite not leading in the manufacturing of these cutting-edge chips, the U.S. still holds a whopping 50.2% of the global market share.
It's a good point. It highlights that it's not just about churning out chips, it's about the whole package.
Whole ecosystem.
Exactly. The U.S. remains dominant because they excel in other areas like design, software, and they've built a really robust ecosystem of supporting companies.
So it's not just about making the chips, it's about having all the pieces of the puzzle, right?
Precisely. And that's where China's playing catch-up. They're investing heavily, don't get me wrong, but they're not quite there yet.
But they are making strides in some areas, right?
Absolutely. Especially in specific types of chips like those used for AI. The report says they're only about 2 years behind in that area. But for things like memory chips, which are in everything, or the actual manufacturing equipment, it's a bigger hurdle, more like a 5-year gap.
So mixed bag.
Pretty much. And that's where China's overall strategy comes into play. They've set their sights on nothing less than complete self-sufficiency in the semiconductor industry.
Which is a big goal.
To say the least. They're talking about pouring trillions, with the T, of dollars into achieving this. Now, such a massive investment, it could definitely accelerate their progress, but it also raises some big questions.
About whether it's sustainable in the long run.
Exactly. And what impact it will have on the global market. Can you really have fair competition when you've got that level of government intervention? These are all questions we'll be exploring as we dive deeper into this report.
Okay, so it's clear China has a plan, a really big plan,
Definitely ambitious.
to say the least. But how are they actually putting this plan into action? What's happening on the ground?
Well, the report actually gets into some really interesting examples, specific Chinese companies and some of their innovations.
So we're moving away from the bird's eye view to like a street level view.
Exactly. And these aren't just random examples. They were chosen carefully because they really illustrate how China is approaching this whole thing.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
So one example that really stands out is Huawei and their Mate 60 Pro smartphone.
Oh, yeah, I remember hearing about this. Didn't it make a splash because of the chip it uses?
Big time. This phone caused a stir because it uses a 7-nanometer chip.
Yeah.
And the thing is, Huawei designed and manufactured this chip themselves.
Without access to the best equipment.
Exactly. They did it without the most advanced lithography machines. So it was a real statement.
Like, hey, we can innovate even with our hands tied.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the way they did it, it's pretty clever. They used a technique called double patterning.
Double patterning. Sounds like they're working twice as hard.
In a way, they are. Essentially, imagine you're trying to create a really detailed drawing, but you can only use a thick marker. So to get those fine lines, you have to color over the same area multiple times very carefully.
Oh, okay. So it's like a workaround.
Yeah, exactly. And it works,
Yeah.
but it's more time-consuming and more expensive than using the more advanced lithography techniques.
Yeah.
But the fact that they did it shows their commitment.
Yeah. It's like they're saying, we're not going to let a little thing like not having the best tools stop us.
Right. And the report makes an interesting point about this. They argue that for Huawei, this good enough approach might actually be sufficient, at least for their domestic market.
Right, because they have a massive market in China.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's Huawei. What other companies are on this innovation fast track?
So another one the report highlights is this company called Byron Technology. They're kind of going head-to-head with NVIDIA.
NVIDIA, the graphics card people.
Yep, exactly.
Yep.
But they're not just making graphics cards, they're designing GPUs.
GPUs. Remind me what those are again.
Those are specialized processors. They're using a bunch of things, gaming,
Yeah.
but also AI, data centers, that sort of thing. High-performance computing, basically.
Okay, right. So this company, Byron Technology, they're competing in that space.
Yeah. And the chip that's got everyone's attention, it's called the BR100. It's supposed to be insanely fast.
Yeah.
And they're using a really interesting approach to chip design called chiplet technology.
Chiplet technology. Is that like those tiny houses, but for computer chips?
Kinda, yeah. It's a really cool concept. So instead of building one massive monolithic chip, they're basically connecting smaller, more specialized chips together.
Like Lego blocks for processors.
Exactly. And it's got some advantages. It can be more efficient, more flexible.
It's more power through teamwork.
In a way, yes. And it's interesting to note, it's not just Biren that's exploring this. Even companies like Intel are looking into chiplets.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it's a trend. But back to Biren for a second. Are they actually surpassing established companies like NVIDIA?
That's the million-dollar question. In terms of raw processing power, they're getting really close.
Okay, so that's impressive. But
NVIDIA, they have this incredibly strong software ecosystem that surrounds their GPUs.
so it's not just about the hardware, it's about the software too.
It's everything. It's like having a powerful engine but no steering wheel or brakes.
Okay, I get it. You need both to really compete. All right, so we've got Huawei with their workaround strategy and Biren taking on the big boys with their Lego-like chips. Who else is on the list?
So last but not least, we have SMIC.
SMIC. That name rings a bell.
They're kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
SMIC is China's largest contract chip maker.
Contract chip maker.
Yeah, so they manufacture chips that other companies design.
Mhm.
Sort of like a made-to-order chip factory.
Okay, got it. So how are they doing? Are they innovating?
Oh, absolutely. The report actually does a really good job of charting their journey. They went from lagging behind the industry leaders to actually producing 7-nanometer chips.
That's pretty impressive.
It is. And they managed to do it partly because of what they're calling an Intel-like breakthrough.
An Intel-like breakthrough. Okay, I'm going to need you to break that one down for me.
So imagine you're trying to bake a really complicated cake. You wouldn't start with that, right? You'd start with something simpler, like cookies, and gradually work your way up.
Yeah, I'd be eating a lot of cookies.
Right. But SMIC, they basically looked at the designs and techniques used for a more advanced generation of chips and used that knowledge to perfect their existing process and then skip a step.
So they went straight to the complicated cake.
Exactly. It's risky,
Yeah.
but for SMIC, it seems to have paid off.
Gutsy move. But even with this breakthrough, are they home free?
Well, not entirely. High-volume manufacturing at those advanced nodes, that's still a challenge for them.
So quantity, not just quality, is still an issue.
Exactly. Even with the government pouring resources into their efforts, there's still a bottleneck there.
Okay, so we've zoomed in on these companies, their innovations, their workarounds. But what's the bigger picture here? The report talks about China's overall strategy, things like the National IC Plan, Made in China 2025, and of course those massive government investments we keep hearing about. Is this all just talk, or is there real substance behind these initiatives?
Oh, there's definitely substance there. It all comes back to this overarching goal of self-sufficiency in the semiconductor industry. They want to control the entire process, from designing to manufacturing, even having all the equipment to do it all themselves.
So it's about reducing reliance on other countries, especially for something as critical as semiconductors.
Exactly. The report makes a good point about this. Imagine what happens if suddenly you couldn't get semiconductors anymore. No more
hmm
smartphones, no new cars, even your refrigerator might start having problems. It would be chaos.
Yeah, no kidding. Everything relies on these tiny chips. But if China achieves this goal of complete self-sufficiency, what happens then?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The report highlights some potential outcomes. One concern is the impact of government subsidies.
Because Chinese companies are getting a lot of financial support, right?
Exactly. And that allows them to potentially undercut competitors on price, even if it means selling at a loss initially.
So it's not really a level playing field.
That's the worry. And it could stifle innovation if companies can't reinvest because they're being squeezed out on price.
Makes you think about those long-term implications, right? It's not just about who makes the most chips, but what the overall impact on the industry is. Now, something else that caught my eye in the report was this mention of a shift in China's approach. It sounds like they're moving away from a more, I don't know, scientist-led model to something more centralized, more government-controlled. What do you make of that?
It's an interesting development. It suggests they might be recognizing that their earlier approach, while yielding some results, might not have been efficient enough to really close the gap at the top.
So they're switching things up.
It seems that way. This more centralized approach, it could potentially speed things up, streamline decision-making. But, and this is a big but, there's always the risk that too much top-down control could stifle creativity, that kind of out-of-the-box thinking that often drives innovation.
It's a trade-off then.
It seems that way, and it will be fascinating to see how this new approach plays out in the long run. Definitely something to keep an eye on.
So much to unpack here. To sum it all up, it seems like China is innovating when it comes to semiconductors, but it's not this like unstoppable wave. They're making real progress in certain areas, finding clever ways to get around limitations, and they're incredibly ambitious about becoming self-sufficient.
Absolutely, and they've got the resources to back up those ambitions. I think the big question we're left with is, what does this all mean for the future? Not just for China, but for the entire semiconductor industry, for global tech, even for our everyday lives.
It really makes you think. As always, thanks for diving deep with us, everyone. Keep asking those questions, and we'll catch you next time.